My husband told me our marriage was over at the breakfast table in the same calm voice he used to read me stock reports. He had already moved $3.2 million out of our joint accounts. He had spent 14 months preparing before he said a word to me. In the parking lot of the Buncombe County Courthouse, he looked at me and said quietly, so no one else could hear, "You won't be seeing those grandchildren much. I've spoken to Braden." Then he walked to his car. 8 months later, his business partner called my cell phone and said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, I thought you should know. Duncan collapsed this morning." Good day, dear listeners. It's Hannah. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Please take a moment to like this video, and if this story stays with you, leave me a comment and let me know what city you're listening from. It helps me understand how far these stories travel. Now I want to share with you the story of a woman who, at 71 years old, with no income, no legal background, and very nearly no money, did the one thing her husband had spent 14 months making sure she could not do. My name is Georgina May Ellsworth. I was 71 years old when my husband told me our marriage was over. Duncan was 74. We had been together for 46 years, long enough that his habits had woven themselves into the fabric of my own daily life without either of us noticing. The way he read the newspaper out loud when he found something that interested him, whether or not I had asked. The way he took his coffee in a chipped blue ceramic mug that had been broken since 2003 and refused to replace. The way he fell asleep during the first 10 minutes of any movie and then denied it. We lived in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house on Wren Creek Road we had owned since 1994. Stone chimney, a deep covered porch, a kitchen garden I had tended for 30 years. We had 2 children, our son Braden, 47, who lived in Charlotte with his wife and their 2 boys, and our daughter Celine, 44, who lived in Raleigh. 4 grandchildren in total. That was my life. That was what I believed was solid and permanent. I had been a librarian for 34 years. I retired from the county public library system at 63 and had spent the years since tending the garden, reading, volunteering at the literacy program downtown, and video calling the grandchildren on a laptop I had bought specifically for that purpose. I knew how to catalog. I knew how to look for what was missing from a shelf. What I did not know, until I needed to, was how to look for something that had been deliberately hidden. The first sign was small. In the early fall of the year before Duncan filed, I began finding small inconsistencies. A deposit receipt in his slacks pocket, a bank we held no joint accounts with, a bank I had never heard of. I asked him about it at dinner. He said it was a client transaction he was processing. He said it the same way he said everything, with the flat, settled certainty of a man who is never expected to be questioned. 2 weeks later, the quarterly investment summary we received in the mail did not arrive. I was always the one who filed those documents. I called the brokerage office. The representative told me the mailing address on the account had been updated. Updated to Duncan's office address, not our home. I said nothing. I watched. He had been a financial advisor for 31 years. He knew those numbers the way I knew the Dewey Decimal System, instinctively, without looking. He had always managed our money. That had been the arrangement. I had managed the house, the children, the garden, the decades. He had managed the ledger. It had seemed reasonable in 1978. It had seemed reasonable for 46 years. It stopped seeming reasonable the morning he set down his chipped blue mug and said, "Georgina, I've retained an attorney. I want a divorce. Not I'm unhappy. Not I think we should talk. Not even I'm sorry. Just, I want a divorce." I asked if there was someone else. He said, "That's not the relevant question." And he picked up his mug and walked to his home office and closed the door. 46 years. He said it the way you'd cancel a subscription you'd forgotten you had. Her name was Moira. I did not learn this until much later. She was 49, 25 years younger than Duncan, a certified financial planner with a practice in Asheville. She had been advising him, I would eventually discover, on considerably more than market timing. What came next, I was wholly unprepared for. Duncan had retained 2 attorneys at a firm that specialized in high-asset divorce proceedings. I did not know this was its own specialty until I needed one myself. I hired a man named Gareth Finch, a kind, thorough estate attorney who had written most of Asheville's wills for 3 decades and was somewhat out of his depth in what turned out to be a case built around a revocable living trust and 14 months of systematic financial preparation. The trust was the thing we didn't see clearly. Duncan had established it, the Ellsworth Family Revocable Trust, and had placed our jointly accumulated investment accounts into it, retirement holdings, brokerage accounts, savings instruments. $3.2 million moved into a legal structure that named Duncan as sole trustee and Moira as a co-trustee and contingent beneficiary. His attorneys argued it was a legitimate estate planning vehicle and therefore separate from the marital estate. I did not know the trust existed. Gareth explained this to me in his office, and I felt the same cold I had felt finding the bank receipt in Duncan's pocket. The settlement he negotiated left me with the house, valued at $890,000, with $140,000 still owed on the mortgage and $185,000 in liquid assets. The trust was ruled outside the marital estate, pending further review. Duncan left court with $3.2 million that had been ours together since 1978. Braden had called 3 days after Duncan announced the divorce. There was a rehearsed quality to his voice, a settled calm that didn't match what should have been distress in a man who had just learned his parents were separating. He said, "Mom, Dad," explained the situation. "He's been unhappy for a long time. I think we need to respect that." I asked what exactly his father had explained. He said he didn't want to get into it. Celine sent a text. 4 words, "I love you, Mom." That was all. No call, no visit. I sat with those 4 words for a long time. In the parking lot of the courthouse after the preliminary hearing, Duncan stopped walking and turned to me. He said, very quietly, "You won't be seeing those grandchildren much. I've spoken to Braden." He said it with the same flat certainty he used for everything, and then he walked to his car. I drove to my sister Lottie's house in Boone. I don't remember the first hour. I remember arriving. Lottie was 67, a retired art teacher, widowed 7 years earlier and rebuilt quietly and without ceremony. She lived in a small house outside town that smelled like turpentine and dried flowers, and she opened the door before I reached the porch. She always knew when I was coming. I stayed 4 weeks. I slept badly. I let her old rescue hound sleep at the foot of the bed, which helped more than I could explain. I made lists. That is what 34 years of cataloging does to a person. It teaches you that the first step in any problem is to describe accurately what you have. I wrote down what I had lost: the accounts, the money, my children, Braden absent and strategic, Celine present only in those 4 words. And then, in the 3rd week, at Lottie's kitchen table with tea that had gone cold, I stopped writing what I had lost and started writing questions. When had the trust been established? Who was Moira, exactly? A financial planner, which meant she held a professional license, which meant she had professional obligations. When had Duncan first consulted his attorneys, relative to when he had decided to divorce me? And had Gareth ever verified the timeline? I called Gareth from Lottie's kitchen and asked him one question. Had he verified when the trust had been formed relative to when Duncan had first engaged divorce counsel? Because in North Carolina, a revocable trust created with the intent to deprive a spouse of equitable distribution could potentially constitute fraudulent transfer of marital property. And if the intent preceded the filing by a demonstrable margin, there was a pause. "Mrs. Ellsworth," Gareth said, "that is a very specific question." "I know," I said. "Can you answer it?" He could not. He had not looked. I spent 2 evenings researching on the laptop I had bought to video call the grandchildren. I found the name of a firm in Asheville, Chen and Associates, Complex Marital Asset Litigation. I called on a Monday and made an appointment for Thursday. Margot Chen was in her mid-40s, precise and still in the way that the best reference librarians I had ever worked with were still. People who have learned that listening is its own form of intelligence. She shook my hand and asked me to start from the beginning. I talked for nearly 2 hours. She took notes. She asked specific questions: dates, account names, entity names. When I finished, she looked at what she had written and said, "The trust. Do you know the exact date of formation?" I told her I didn't. "That," she said, "is the first thing we need." I retained Margot that afternoon. It cost me $9,500, more than half of my accessible cash, and I signed without hesitating. Some expenditures are not expenses. They are decisions. Margot filed the post-judgment motion within 10 days, citing potential fraudulent conveyance and requesting full discovery of Duncan's financial records for the preceding 3 years. The court accepted it. Discovery notices went to Duncan's attorneys. I knew the moment Duncan received them because Braden called again. His voice was different this time, tighter, the managed calm coming apart slightly at the edges. He said, "Mom, Dad says you've hired new lawyers. He says you're trying to reopen everything. This is only going to cost you money you don't have and make everything harder for everyone." I said, "Braden, did your father ask you to make this call?" A silence, its own answer. "Tell him I'm well," I said, and I ended the call. After I hung up, I sat very still and understood something I had been circling for months. Duncan had built this system the same way he had built the trust, methodically, in advance, with a specific outcome in mind. The calls through Braden, the timing of the pressure, the certainty in his voice in that parking lot. He had been counting on me to disappear quietly. He had been counting on it for 14 months before he filed. He had miscalculated. The discovery documents arrived 6 weeks later. The Ellsworth Family Revocable Trust had been established on February 11th. Duncan's divorce filing had been submitted to the court on April 22nd of the following year, 14 months later. But the document that changed everything was a set of email records recovered during discovery. Communications between Duncan and his lead attorney, Aldous Crane, dating from the January 14 months before the filing. In those emails, Duncan had written, "I need to begin moving things before I pull the trigger on the filing. Moira says the market timing is right for the transfer." Moira says. I read those 2 words sitting in Margot's office on a gray February afternoon and felt something crystallize inside me. Not rage, which I had already moved through and out of, but something colder and more architectural. A structure of intention that was solid and load-bearing. Moira, a licensed financial planner, a woman bound by professional obligations to her own clients, had been advising Duncan on how to remove marital assets from our joint estate before our marriage was legally ended. She had been doing this while Duncan and I were still sharing a house, a kitchen, a life. "Is this enough?" I asked. Margot allowed herself a small, controlled smile. "It's a strong start," she said. Celine came to Lottie's house on a Saturday in April. She had driven 4 hours from Raleigh and called ahead, which felt more like a warning than a courtesy. She brought white tulips, which struck me as a strangely cheerful choice. She sat across from me at Lottie's kitchen table and folded her hands, and I thought, she has been coached. "Mom," she said, "Braden and I have talked. We love you. We want this to end." "Did your father ask you to come?" I said. She hesitated 1 beat too long. "I'm here because I'm your daughter," she said. "You sent a text when he announced the divorce," I said. Something shifted behind her eyes. "Dad says the trust was legitimate estate planning," she said. "He says your attorneys are drawing this out because they have a financial interest in prolonging it." I noted that last part. It was designed to do something specific. Make me doubt Margot. Make me feel that the one person genuinely on my side had her own agenda. "There are emails," I said, "dated and authenticated. In your father's own words, Celine. Not mine. Not my attorney's interpretation. His words to his attorney, establishing when he decided to divorce me and why he moved the money first." A brief flash in her expression. She hadn't known about the emails. "Dad says those are being misrepresented," she said. Her voice was thinner. "His attorneys can say that to the judge," I said. She stayed another hour, She cycled through the same points: Braden's sons, Duncan's age, the toll of prolonged litigation, the idea that I was being influenced by people with a financial interest in the outcome. When she left, she hugged me in the doorway, a real hug, not an obligatory one. And I watched her car disappear down Lottie's gravel drive and felt a specific sadness that had nothing to do with anger. My daughter had come not to support me, but to manage me. I didn't know yet whether she believed what she was saying, or whether she was performing it because it was easier than the alternative. The offer came in early May through Margot's office. Duncan's attorneys proposed a revised settlement: $620,000 in exchange for dropping all litigation and signing a comprehensive release of claims. The release covered the current fraud motion, any future claims against the trust, and any claims against Moira professionally. It included a non-disparagement clause that would have prohibited me from discussing the circumstances of my divorce with anyone. I read every page carefully. He was worried. That was the first thing I understood from reading it. If he were not worried, he would have offered nothing. I thought about $620,000 genuinely. I am not a fool, and I was not so convinced of my own righteousness that I ignored arithmetic. At 71, with no income and mounting legal costs, $620,000 was a real number. It would have covered the rest of my life reasonably. I sat with that possibility for 2 days. But the non-disparagement clause was not a protection against embarrassment. It was a seal, a legal wall built to ensure that what Duncan had done, the 14 months of preparation, the emails, the trust, Moira's professional involvement in all of it, would never appear on any public record. He wasn't just buying my silence, he was buying the erasure of what had happened. I had spent 34 years as a librarian because I believed that facts matter, that accuracy matters, that when something has happened, it deserves to be named correctly. What Duncan had done had a correct name. I wanted the court to say it. "I'm declining," I told Margot. She nodded. She did not look surprised. The hearing was held in late September. I wore the charcoal blazer I had bought for my retirement reception at the library 7 years before. Some occasions require a specific kind of seriousness. Duncan arrived with Aldous Crane and a second attorney I hadn't seen before. He looked older than he had in the spring, thinner, walking more carefully. When he entered the courtroom, he glanced at me and looked away. He still believed he was the only one paying attention. I had learned, over the preceding 8 months, that this was his oldest and most consistent habit. Margot presented the evidence with the precision of someone who knows exactly where every fact lives: the trust formation date, the January emails, the timeline establishing Duncan's intent 14 months before he filed, the forensic accountant she had retained, Dr. Ellsworth Park, had produced a 38-page analysis of Duncan's financial activity across the 30 months preceding the divorce filing. The picture it built was detailed and damning: a systematic, deliberate transfer of marital assets, undertaken with the active professional involvement of Moira, whose role was documented in the emails as having advised on the transfer strategy and timing. Aldous Crane's defense was that the trust had been formed for legitimate estate planning purposes, unconnected to any divorce decision. He produced a letter from an estate planning attorney suggesting the structure was a standard tax efficiency measure. The judge, the Honorable Lenora Westcott, methodical and precise in the way of someone who has been reading documents for 20 years and knows exactly where the inconsistencies hide, listened, took notes, and began asking. She asked Crane, if the trust had been formed for estate planning purposes, why had Duncan's own communications described its formation as a prerequisite for the divorce filing? Crane answered. The judge asked a follow-up. And then Duncan did something his attorneys could not have planned for. He leaned forward and said, not quietly enough, "That money is mine. I built that. It's mine." The courtroom went still. Judge Westcott looked at him directly over her glasses. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, "your attorney is addressing the court." Crane touched Duncan's arm. Duncan shook it off, a small, sharp motion. The second attorney leaned in and whispered something. Duncan shook his head. I watched his hands from across the room, flat on the table, jaw set. And I recognized something I had seen occasionally in 46 years of marriage and had always been too close to name accurately. Duncan's rage was not at me, or at Margot, or at the evidence. He was furious at uncertainty, at the fact that the outcome was no longer his to control. He had expected certainty. I had given him something else entirely. Judge Westcott issued her written ruling 26 days later. I was at Lottie's kitchen table, drinking coffee, when Margot called at 8:40 in the morning. By clear and convincing evidence, Judge Westcott had found that Duncan had engaged in fraudulent transfer of marital property. The Ellsworth Family Revocable Trust had been established with the intent to remove marital assets from equitable distribution, predating the divorce filing by 14 months, and established in active coordination with Moira, who had provided professional advice toward that end. The trust was dissolved. All assets within it were returned to the marital estate. I was awarded 57% of the total marital estate. After accounting for all holdings, the figure came to approximately $2.1 million. Moira was named in the opinion as a knowing participant in the fraudulent transfer. Her professional conduct was referred to the State Licensing Board. A separate civil claim against her was available, Margot said, if I chose to pursue it. I set the phone down. Lottie was in the doorway. She had heard enough. She crossed the kitchen, and we held each other the way sisters do, not gracefully, but completely. And I felt, for the first time in many months, the specific relief of a weight that has been carried so long you have stopped perceiving it as weight. You only notice it when it is gone. We did not speak for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying that the quiet couldn't hold better. 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning in December, a number I didn't recognize appeared on my phone. I answered. A man identified himself as an associate with Aldous Crane's firm. His voice was careful in the particular way that means the news it carries has been calculated in advance. Duncan had collapsed at his office the previous Friday, a cardiac event. He had been alone when it happened. He was 74 years old. Moira had not been there. Braden told me, in the call he made 2 days later, that she had ended things shortly after the judgment was issued. I stood in Lottie's hallway with the phone in my hand and stayed very still for a long time. What do you feel when the man who wronged you is gone? I have thought about this question many times since that December morning. The answer is not clean, and I will not make it clean. I felt grief, real, specific grief for the man he had been in 1977, the man who read me weather forecasts whether I wanted them or not, who kept a chipped blue mug because he couldn't abide waste. I felt the hollow that anger makes when there is no longer any object to direct it toward. And underneath both of those things, I felt a sober, clear-eyed recognition that the ruling stood. His death did not erase the judgment. His estate was bound by it. I went back to Lottie's kitchen table. I poured a cup of coffee. I sat with all of it and did not try to resolve it into something neater than it was. Celine called me the Sunday after I learned about Duncan. She was crying before I could say a word. She said she had read the ruling, the full text, publicly accessible through the court records, and she said she had not known about the emails. Her father had told her the trust was legitimate estate planning, that my attorneys had misrepresented everything. She had believed him. She said, "Mom, he lied to me too." I held the phone and listened and thought about all the different kinds of loss that had moved through that year, not only mine. "I know," I said. "I should have called," she said. "From the beginning, I should have." "Yes," I said, "but you can call now." Braden took longer. He called in January, brief, still carrying more weight than it unpacked. But it was a call. That was something. The grandchildren came back gradually. A video call here, a visit there. Tentative on all sides, I did not press. I let it come at whatever pace it came. The estate proceedings took 9 months. Duncan's estate was administered by a court-appointed executor legally bound to honor the judgment. The trust assets were liquidated and the distribution made. I bought a small stone and cedar cottage on the eastern slope of the Blue Ridge, a covered porch, a pear tree in the back corner of the yard, older than the house itself. I planted a kitchen garden. Rosemary, sage, a row of tomatoes I had no illusions would outperform the deer. I found a library in the nearby town where I became, after a few months, a familiar face, first as a patron, then as a Tuesday and Thursday morning volunteer in the adult literacy program. 34 years cataloging. I know how to make information findable for the people who need it. I made a friend named Dulcie, 73, a retired music teacher from Boone, who walked the same unpaved road every morning at 7. We began walking together without planning to. That is how the best friendships begin, not by arrangement, but by repetition. As for Moira, the licensing board opened a formal review of her professional conduct following the court opinion. She contested it. She lost her license for 1 year and was placed on a supervised reinstatement program. Several of her institutional clients ended their relationships with her firm after the case became known in regional professional circles. Duncan's estate, after the judgment and legal fees and administrative costs were settled, left her very little. The judgment was a senior claim. There was not much else left for anyone else. I received this information from Margot without much commentary and received it the same way, as a fact, an outcome reflecting the choices that produced it. Not always, not inevitably, but sometimes. This was one of those times. I sit on my covered porch in the evenings now, when the light comes off the ridge at the angle it only manages in late autumn. Long and amber and quietly generous, and I think about what the year cost and what it returned. I did not get back what I had. That is not how any of this works. I got something different, a house that is mine in every room, a life assembled from scratch, at 71, without a blueprint, friendships chosen deliberately, a silence I earned. Here is what I know now that I did not know when I was sitting across from Duncan at the breakfast table, listening to him tell me in his flat, certain voice that it was over. Silence, when someone counts on it, is not peace. It is a gift you give to the person who is harming you. I am not a remarkable woman. I am a woman who paid attention when it mattered most. Who asked the right questions at the right time. Who declined to make the legal fact of what had been done to her disappear behind a non-disparagement clause and a check. That was enough, more than enough. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone or something you've been carrying, please leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Subscribe if you haven't yet. And thank you, truly, for being here with me today.